What's up, guys? Today's video is a little bit different. Today I have a very special guest joining me and the YouTube channel, Igor Dragovic. Igor is a development manager from Republic Developments, and he's here today to give us a glimpse into the pre-construction development process. Igor, thank you for joining me today.
For having me here. It's a pleasure.
As someone who has extensive expertise in planning, policy, and entitlement stages of projects, I thought you'd be the perfect person to have on the channel to join me and discuss the complex and convoluted development process that builders have to go through in order to actually bring a pre-construction project to the market.
Happy to be here and provide an opinion on that or some insight on that.
Wonderful. Well, before we get into all the juicy details, why don't you tell the viewers a little bit about yourself, how you got started in the industry, what you're doing today, and give us a glimpse into Republic Developments and your pipeline.
Sure, happy to. So I think, I've always been a big fan or, passionate about development and cities and sort of influence economics and politics, I guess, led me to studying geography in undergrad and graduate studies. When I finished that, started working as a consultant in urban metrics, worked there for a few years, and that was sort of the perfect entrance into the development industry for me. I've kind of felt a bit inspired in that time. After that, spent about 7 years working for the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, wrote the growth plan and the fair housing plan there, then moved over to the City of Toronto in the seating planning division. So wrote a number of land use plans, urban design guidelines, helped approve a number of large master plan projects. And last summer, moved over to Republic Developments. I've been there for just over a year now. It's been a very fun and great ride. We have a big development pipeline, about 11,000 units in there, of which about 7,000 are part of the Scarborough Junction project at the southeast corner of St. Clair Kennedy. We also have a large park plan there, community center, a daycare, a brand new GO station, really an intimately programmed retail environment there as well, a lot of public spaces and privately operated public spaces and mews. And then we have another number of other sites, about 6 across the City of Toronto, one near Trinity Bellwoods, a mid-rise development there, 2 high-rise developments, in the downtown, one near Yonge and Front, another one near Yonge and Bloor, and 3 sort of mid-rise, semi-high-rise sites in North York. And yeah, been with Republic for just over a year, as I mentioned. It was actually started by Matt Young, who's our CEO, about 3 years ago, and he sort of honed his craft at Lifetime and Capital Developments, and it's been a very, very fun and exhilarating ride for sure.
That's awesome. When can we potentially expect the first project to come to the market? Can you share these details, or?
We're still undergoing the process, the sort of approvals process on a number of them. We may be getting close to some. If you were to ask me as soon as possible, I would love for it to happen imminently. But a lot of it's sort of within the hands of the municipality at the moment. So hopefully in the next year or two, we get to see some of these projects come to fruition.
Why don't you talk to us a little bit about the development roadmap for an average pre-construction project? An individual such as myself, or an average person off the street, may not know exactly what happens in between the land acquisition process and the final stage, which is sales. So I'm just curious if you can fill in the gap.
Sure, I'm happy to. And it's a great question. And you're right. A lot of people aren't, it's not a lot of things that happen in the public eye, these things, but there's a lot of due diligence, right? As part of, for instance, the land acquisition process, I'd highlight, a couple of key elements that you need to, get organized about and have a very thorough understanding of before you can sort of tie up a site. So one of them is, liaising probably with a planner, either a planner at the city or a private sector planner, to determine what you can realistically build on this particular site that you find. How tall can it be? How many stories? What are the setbacks? What are the step backs? Can it be a tower? Is it a mid-rise site? So that'll give you some insight onto what you can realistically build there, right? The other aspect is sort of understanding the soil conditions, right? So you have to understand the soil bearing capacity. Can the soil that's on that site withstand a tall structure of a building of 20, 30, 40, 50 stories, right? Is there groundwater on site? How will we discharge this groundwater? How tall is the water table? Do we have to waterproof our foundation, right, in our parking garage? Once you have that sort of information, as well as sort of potential remediation or excavation costs, you would plug that into your pro forma and try to determine sort of the viability of developing such a project. If all the stars sort of align at that moment and, it looks like it works, you would go ahead and tie up that site. And in the next step is when you sort of start to assemble a team of consultants to help not only conceptualize what you can and design this sort of concept on site, but also to put together a package that you would submit as an application to the city, right? A formal application. And this is where you start to sort of engage a number of different consultants and experts in these particular fields: surveyors, architects, landscape architects, civil and transportation engineers, energy consultants, wind and noise and vibration consultants, archaeologists, arborists. So, there's a list of various different studies that you do have to provide as part of every application. So it's all available online. You put that together, you submit it to the city, and then the city has, once they receive this application, they distribute it to the various different divisions within the city that would help review. These divisions include like transportation, engineering, construction services, parks, forestry and recreation, energy and environment. And then you'd probably work through about a year to 2 years, roughly about a year and a half process before you would sort of secure your approvals, right? And there's different stages of approvals that correspond to when you can pull certain permits. But to answer your question, once you sort of secure your approvals at the zoning or the site plan stage is often when developers begin marketing or selling their units. Right?
Okay.
And then
that was going to be my next question.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to answer it ahead of you, but I think you probably know this process better than anyone else. But once you sort of secure a certain threshold of sales, you would go to the bank to secure financing for construction, and then you would go ahead and pull your permits and, commence construction and start that whole process, right? And you probably want to be connecting with construction managers and laborers and contractors well before.
Before that, right? Trying to secure labor, which is clearly hard to come by these days.
Exactly, right? Like you nailed it. The supply for labor is tough. It's a very tight market now, and some construction companies are blocked for the next year or two, right? So you want to sort of start that process or start thinking about that process as early as you can.
So the city has recently introduced a slew of new initiatives, from growth funding tools like development charges, a concept where growth pays for growth, to drainage guidelines, minimum parking standards, the Toronto Green Standard, and of course the Inclusionary Zoning. How are these initiatives anticipated to impact new development?
That's a great question. There has been a lot that has come from the city in the last year, especially. I mean, you yourself have noted development charges have increased, right? And that's something like 49-50%, right?
Yeah.
Or that's what they're proposing to increase them.
Dramatic increase.
Yeah, right. And if you've been in the industry for the last few years, I mean, you've been privy to these increases. I mean, the last time in 2018 when the city came out with their development charge bylaw, at that point, those were quite high increases. If we look around other municipalities surrounding the city of Toronto, there's, DCs have increased 500-600% over the last 10 years, right? So it's where those costs go, they get ultimately passed down to the new home buyer, right? And it's a much more politically palatable decision to make rather than, for instance, raising property taxes. And you and I, we can get into a whole other discussion about municipal finance and sort of what works, what doesn't. But that's one aspect that's definitely going to be contributing to rising house prices, right? If you're increasing DCs by 50%, that cost has to be passed on to somebody, unfortunately.
Right. So essentially, to explain it to you guys, if the city increases DCs, the builder will just simply increase the cost of the unit, and the end user, so the buyer, will have to kind of stomach not the entirety of the increase, but a significant portion of it. Yeah.
I mean, there's a whole load of financial engineering that goes on behind it, but once you tack on more costs, I mean, at the same time, the city expects that land values will take that hit, but it's unlikely because that expects vendors, right, landowners and vendors to actually be okay with a
Right, taking a
reduced
discount.
land value, right? So it becomes like a game of hot potato in a sense, right? The other ones that you touched upon, for instance, like the drainage guidelines, that came in January of earlier this year, was sort of began being in force. And that requires that you discharge your groundwater to a private, so you're not allowed to discharge any groundwater to the public sewage system, right? Simply speaking, the public sewage system cannot handle not only the growth that we're facing, but all the water that needs to be sort of extracted out of the ground. So you have to figure out a way to sort of get rid of that groundwater, or you can bathtub, as we call them, your foundation, so sort of make it waterproof. That obviously is likely going to add to costs as well of development and construction. There's also the Toronto Green Standard, which is, that's something I don't think anyone would dispute the efficacy or the importance of the Toronto Green Standard. I think we all want to see, more energy efficient buildings, carbon being offset, a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, or a sort of a curbing of it. We understand that buildings themselves, from, latest research around the world shows like buildings contribute like 40% to greenhouse gas emissions, right? So if there's any way we can help reduce that, we can have a huge impact on sort of trying to mitigate climate change issues. So that's a big one, and that's likely going to add to cost as well, because you're going to have to think of different materials.
Yeah, ultimately the builder is the one who has to take advantage of newer technologies, improve their efficiency, stuff like that.
Exactly. And I mean, the good thing about the TGS is as it becomes more common and it becomes the norm, the prices will stabilize in that, right? Like
maybe solar panels.
Yeah, but definitely, right? Like anything like heat pumps, geothermal energy, right? Like those are the kind of things that we're starting to think about, and that actually could reduce a lot of costs, right? If you apply geothermal energy as opposed to actually like classic, natural gas heating. Other materials like timber, for instance, you probably have been at Queens Quay and seen that. I think Heinz, their office building, that's timber frame.
Yes, of course, yeah,
and it looks beautiful. I mean, as a skeleton, it looks stunning right now. But that's some examples that we're seeing of it starting to take place, or people being innovative about it. You also have the minimum parking standards, which I think are a big step in the right direction by the city, right? So the city's recently gotten rid of any minimum or maximum parking standards, and now, well, actually they have a maximum parking standard, but you can build projects now without any parking spaces, right? And maybe just provide visitors parking spaces.
Right. So just so you guys know, on February the 3rd, the City Council amended the minimum parking zoning bylaw. And so essentially, like Igor mentioned, builders are now able to develop and build very few parking spots, all in an effort to discourage cars in the core, encourage cycling, things like that.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the reasons. The other thing that that the city found, and I remember through my discussions with our transportation engineers and consultants, is they actively take tours of parking garages through the city, and they've noticed that over the last few years, parking garages are becoming underutilized, right? So there's less and less people using all the spots. And then that brings the question is like, okay, are we oversupplying the amount of parking? Do we really need to provide, P4 levels? Can we just do 2 levels, maybe 1? Can we just provide visitor parking? And that's sort of an exciting direction that we're going into, because you want to discourage, or you want to encourage other forms or active forms of transportation, as well as transit usage, especially in a place like downtown. We can't expand our street network any more than it is. We're already a built-out city, so we really only have a finite amount of space to accommodate all modes of mobility. But I think there was a good example. I believe it was a Menkes project on Dundas Street, which is recently had submitted a proposal, and they are providing, I think, like 10 visitors parking spaces. And
wow. Correct me if I'm wrong, but builders are happy to see this change, right? Because I had a meeting with a builder recently. They mentioned the fact that it literally costs them $80,000 to build a single parking space, and then they have to sell it for in the core, you can't really find a parking space in any new development for less than 100K, right? So that's also a tough sell for, a lot of people can't really stomach that. So seeing that change, I assume builders are thrilled, and that will, help with housing affordability to a degree, but also will help with, I guess, builder margins. Yeah.
I mean, you actually put it quite well. It's something, depends ultimately where you're developing, right? If we're developing in the suburbs, then you do want to probably provide some parking just because
Right.
demand may be greater than if we're building in the core or like close to a subway station. Realistically, you probably shouldn't be providing any parking unless it's maybe like a luxury development and you want to attract a certain clientele of
Yeah.
purchasers. But you're right, it's likely to save us cost, right? The other thing is we don't have to go below grade anymore, and we just have to maybe provide caissons or do a foundation without having to excavate all that soil. And in that way, that could indirectly help us out through this whole drainage guidelines piece, right? So if we don't need to, or if we're not providing an underground level, we're not going to be getting into that water table. Thus, we may
Right.
not need to discharge that groundwater,
Right.
right? So in a way, this could be a very positive change that could help alleviate a number of issues.
So another big one that I want to mention in terms of initiative is the inclusionary zoning. So this one's had a lot of media coverage. And so for you guys, November the 9th, 2021, City Council adopted inclusionary zoning, which essentially mandates affordable housing units that have to be provided in all new residential development of 100 units or more in the city of Toronto. So any project more than 100 units, 5 to 10% of it in terms of GFA, gross floor area,
It's
has to be allocated to affordable housing.
exactly, yeah, and it's coming into effect in September. It's not citywide, right? So it doesn't apply to every corner of the city. It's only in certain pockets that are sort of close to major transit station areas, right? So subway stations, LRTs, major BRT stops like bus rapid transit. So within there, you will have to provide, starting in September, a certain portion of your housing or your gross floor area will have to be dedicated to affordable housing. And these housing units will have to be identical in terms of materials, finishes, sizes, layouts to
Right.
your market units,
Right.
right? So that's happening. However, that has been adopted by City Council in November. It's tied to the major transit station area sort of policies that are also, were actually yesterday at Planning and Housing Committee and will be at Council in a few days. But these two things have to be approved by the Minister of Municipal Affairs, right? They get the final say on this, and we will see how that will play out there. But they get the final say on that.
And in terms of the people that are able to take advantage of these affordable housing units, is based on my research, it's anybody between household income between like 30K and 80K or something like that.
So they have thresholds identified,
Right.
for certain types of units. And the inclusionary zoning, it's important to note that this isn't, it's not particularly developed for that sort of lowest quintile,
Right.
It's more so for teachers, daycare workers, things like that, people like the middle class.
Yes.
So like you've probably seen some of the presentations that the city's had, and they've shown little avatars of who they're targeting and the incomes that they're targeting. So that's, another big initiative that's coming down, and developers have been a little bit wary of it. Just, I think our concern lies mostly with the fact that we haven't been provided any incentives for this. So we're being asked to provide affordable housing without any support from the city, right? Whether that's financial support, so maybe giving us credits in the form of development charge credits, which does happen now through our like open house affordable housing program, or incentives in the form of density, right? So,
Being able to build taller.
yeah, maybe,
Yeah.
We'll give you an extra 5 stories, but you need to provide 50 affordable housing units, right? And I think the most important point I could highlight is developers, like, we are more than happy to build affordable housing units. And that's something that, I, having worked in various different places and at the city as well, I understand, and having studied this, an inclusive city is the city that you want, right? You want a city that has the diversity. A city like Toronto is, I think, an amazing place, globally speaking. And I don't like no developer would shy away from building affordable housing units. I think we're very supportive of that. I think we need those types of things. It's just who delivers it? How do we deliver it? Right? Someone's going to have to pay for it. Is there a way we can do it collectively or something? Right?
Okay, so the next thing I want to ask you about is the current economic climate and the kind of like recent macroeconomic outlook and how that's impacting new development. So things like, you know, rapid interest rate hikes, inflation that's doesn't seem to be coming down. What do you think that's going to be doing to, you know, new projects and development over the next couple of years? I don't necessarily anticipate, you know, this type of aggressive rate hike cycle to last, nor do I anticipate this kind of inflation to persist for, you know, a decade. But, you know, it'd be reasonable to assume that over the next couple of years could be challenging. What do you think that will do to new development in Toronto?
That's a very good question. It's a very important one, and it's something that we've all sort of been asking one another, and we've tried to, you know, unpack this issue ourselves as well. And you're right. I mean, inflation has shot up. We kind of all foresaw this happening, and you know, at the start of COVID, once a lot of the free money was being handed out, the question, I think, and everyone who sort of foresaw this, we were like, okay, we're gonna have to pay this money back somehow at some point. What's gonna happen to inflation? However, I will note, and what I'm noticing personally is that, well, first of all, inflation is a bit of a lagging indicator. So it's not reflective of the current situation. And, you know, through my research, I'm finding that certain prices of materials like lumber, steel, and things like that are dropping or have been dropping in the last few months. Food prices as well, like soybeans, grains, oats, things like that have been dropping in the last 2 months or 3 months. That may not yet have made it into the most recent inflation number.
Yeah.
But in terms of interest rate hikes, I do wonder whether some developers who may not be well capitalized or over leveraged, how they will weather this storm, right? Because this is significant. These are significant increases, right? Like 6 months ago, we had interest rates of 2%, right, or so. Now they're at 5%, right? And people are talking about potential further increases up to maybe 6 or 7 by the end of the year.
It's just costing more money to just hold land. You know, some builders may not even be in any sort of building permitting stages. They're just holding land, but it's costing them more to keep it, right?
Especially if you bought in the last few months. I
Right.
mean, if you bought a year ago and you're, you know, well capitalized and you're okay, and maybe you have tenants on there that are paying off this,
Right.
I think you're in fairly good shape, right? I think what it's maybe discouraging is purchases of income producing properties, right? Say if you, like, you know, about a year ago, a couple of months ago, land prices, the interest rates are a bit higher, but you'd maybe you had been able to carry that, right, off the existing tenants, whereas today maybe not, and
Right.
maybe that's putting people on hold of, I don't know if I should be buying land right now. At the same time, some developers, you know, they're continuing on and they're still acquiring land. It hasn't stopped them.
I personally remain very bullish on Canadian housing, simply because of just our aggressive immigration policies alone, of 400,000 immigrants a year for the next 4 or 5 years, record high numbers. So everybody's going to need a place to live. And unfortunately, you know, if we find ourselves in this potential recession right now, or recession, if housing starts stall, like if builders do decide to hold back projects, that only means that 4 or 5 years down the road, we're going to have a shortage of housing. We're going to have less completions, and it's going to be and that's going to put pressure on prices.
That's a very possible scenario, right? Because immigration continues. People still want to come here, right? If you, I mean, there's two sides of all these coins, and the driving force, a lot of it is demand and demographics. But if you go around the world and you talk to people from all over the place, they're very, they're like, I want to be in Canada. I want to be in Toronto. I hear Canada's a great place to be. And, you know, a lot of people want to be here.
It is.
That's ultimately, we have to be cognizant of that. And this is a city that's going to continue changing. It's growing. Like, we add 1 million people every 10 years, right, to the GTA.
Right.
Think about that. Every 10 years, every decade, we grow by 1 million people. And in 10 years, we're gonna have a new a million new residents in here, right? Based on these numbers, maybe potentially even more because we're actually hiking our immigration numbers.
Targets,
So,
yeah. So to wrap up this lovely little chat, I appreciate you. I wanted to ask you one question that I think is important for the average person. Can you recommend a good resource or a website that a person can visit? Like, let's say they're walking down the street, they realize, across the street from them or on their block, there's a new development application. They want to learn what's coming. They want to learn a little bit more. What websites do they turn to?
I mean, I think Urban Toronto is a great one. That's one that, a lot of people in the industry will rely upon. I've been using it for a better part of the decade. They're very, I would definitely, push people to check out the forum. There's a lot of very interesting information, sort of up to date. And another one is the Toronto's meeting minutes for the council and committees. So if you just Google TMMIS, that's like the first thing that comes up. Go to that. It's a little bit complicated at first, maybe, but effectively it tracks every committee and council meeting in the city of Toronto and all the agenda items, their status, what's happening. So you can get a sense of really what is going on around your area, around the city, what status of projects at. And that we're not only talking about development projects, but like infrastructure projects, like water main replacements, new playgrounds, right? New parks. So things like that. And they're all on there, right? And it's sort of updated daily. So if you're really into sort of civic engagement or you want to know what's happening in your city, I would recommend, like, Urban Toronto is a great one. And I call it Tamimis, but other people pronounce it differently. So I definitely encourage people to use those websites. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, I thank you for your time. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you guys enjoyed the content and learned something new. It's likely that Igor will return to the channel. And in the meantime, if you have any questions for either one of us, leave them in the comments section. And I'll see you guys in the next one.